Dragon Quest has a strange history in the United States. It was renamed to Dragon Warrior, and the first game was given away for free with a subscription to Nintendo Power. This was all part of Nintendo's plan to popularize the RPG genre on their console. You can see several articles on RPGs in their first few issues of the magazine. The audience that played NES games tended to skew younger, and they probably didn't know what an RPG was. I know when I started playing NES games, I was very young and had no concept of what a role-playing game was either, so yeah, it probably would have helped me if I had gotten the magazine, but I doubt it. The first Final Fantasy was in a similar situation to Dragon Quest. It had been successful in Japan, but was still struggling to find an audience in North America. Eventually, both series would find their footing here, but it took a little while for that to actually happen, and for RPGs to really go mainstream. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's compare these two games, and I'll talk about which one I like and which one I would rather play. Both of these games are turn-based RPGs, where you have to save the world from some big bad villain. In Dragon Quest, you're trying to defeat the Dragon Lord, and in Final Fantasy, you have to defeat Chaos and break a time loop. Dragon Quest's story is very straightforward. Right from the beginning of the game, you know what you have to do, and you know how the game is going to end. Along the way, you'll learn about a few items that are going to help you along your way, and yeah, ultimately, you just have to defeat the Dragon Lord. Final Fantasy takes you on a larger journey. It has a little bit more going on in it. First, you have to save the princess, then you need to restore light to the 4 crystals, and finally, you have to defeat Garland/Chaos, and it takes a few more twists and turns, but compared to Dragon Quest, it's a much more evolved story. There are a number of similarities between these two games, so the core mechanics are essentially the same for them, and they have similar plot points, but they're just more plot points in Final Fantasy. Let's go into some of the major differences really quick. While there are a few minor differences in the story, gameplay, and graphics, there are 3 major differences between these games that I really want to talk about. Final Fantasy uses a party system and has overall better graphics. This is a darker game in terms of tone and also in graphics. Well, it doesn't go into the realm of dark fantasy. It is a bit more of a serious game, or at least looks more serious than Dragon Quest does. Dragon Quest is a bright and colorful game. It doesn't quite match the tone of the story because it feels like there's a lot more going on, like it should be more serious, but you've got Akira Toriyama's somewhat cute art style going on, so it's a little mismatched, but I kind of like it for that reason. The enemies are a little bit more creative, and I also like the battle scenes more in Dragon Quest than I do in Final Fantasy. There are a lot more things that separate these games. Both of them have the same basic mechanics as being turn-based RPGs. One of them is more refined than the other, and the stories have similar tropes going on, but Final Fantasy goes off in more directions than what Dragon Quest does. Both of these games pretty much are set in a high fantasy world. There's a bit of a difference with Final Fantasy. They have a few more sci-fi elements thrown in where you're fighting robots. Dragon Quest sticks very close to just being a high fantasy game. Both of these games have a pretty simple way of telling their story. Video games are a visual medium, and these games just use the in-game graphics and text boxes to really get everything across. It isn't a bad way of doing it, and it's pretty standard for the time that both of these games came out. You really wouldn't normally see, big cutscenes going on. Dragon Quest uses a first-person perspective in their battle scenes. You also fight fewer monsters at a time. Final Fantasy shows the battle from a side view. You'll have more monsters that you're fighting, so that adds a little bit more strategy to what you have to do. But I will say that the Dragon Quest battle scenes, at least most of them, look better just because there's more colors going on. They don't look as boring as Final Fantasy's does. Final Fantasy is mostly just a black screen with text, and then you get some animations. They're better than what Dragon Quest does, but overall I think those battle scenes kind of look a little boring. Final Fantasy does have the more complex story going on. There are really 3 acts to it, where you have to save your princess, then you go defeat the 4 fiends and restore light to the crystals, and finally you have to go defeat Chaos. I kind of like how this is set up because it builds up as you go through the game. You can see just the natural progression that you have to go through, and there's more side quests and other things that you can go on. They're optional, but it would definitely behoove you to go and do those. Dragon Quest is a very simple story. There really aren't that many optional parts to it. You kind of have to do everything, and it gets done with pretty quick. It's not a very long game. That's kind of it, really. Let's go over just what each of these games does better than the other. Final Fantasy is really a more user-friendly game. Square seems to have taken Dragon Quest and really improved on it in many ways. It has a better user interface, the inventory system is better, and I just like having a party of characters rather than having a solo protagonist in a game. Dragon Quest is full of menus. If you want to open a door, talk to someone, or look for something, or even just go down a set of stairs, you need to open up a menu to do it. Final Fantasy did away with all that, and it made things a lot better. Instead of having everything go into one inventory, Final Fantasy has 3 separate ones for weapons, armor, and then your items and key items. This works much better for me than having to navigate and deal with a relatively small inventory where just everything gets thrown into. I'm not really a big fan of having to manage an inventory in an RPG. I like it in other games, but not in an RPG. I also like having a party of characters when I play an RPG. It just makes things a little bit easier and more strategic than having one character who happens to wear all the hats in a party. These early RPGs didn't usually give you too much to work with when it comes to your main characters. Final Fantasy does that as well. I kind of like that because it lets you use your imagination a little bit more, even if, character development and story kind of suffer a little bit from it. Those are really the big things that I think Final Fantasy does better. Just, having a better inventory, having a party of characters. The story is a little bit more involved and in some cases better than Dragon Quest just because of all the extra stuff you can do. I do like the fact that you can fight more monsters on the screen, that the battles are more strategic. Those are really the big things that I think Final Fantasy does better than the first Dragon Quest. There are a few things that I think Dragon Quest does better than the first Final Fantasy. Most of those have to do with the graphics, and also just how simplistic this game really is. And it helps that I haven't played this one as much as the original Final Fantasy. I enjoy the graphics in Dragon Quest more than Final Fantasy. The characters just look more unique than, your kind of darker fantasy enemies in Final Fantasy, and they're a little bit more imaginative. The battle scenes also just look better to me whenever I see these, just kind of cartoonish monsters show up on the screen, and I see a much brighter and more colorful screen that kind of makes me feel a little bit better. Aside from those things, there really isn't much else that I like more than Final Fantasy. I enjoy Dragon Quest more at this point, just because I've played through Final Fantasy so many frickin' times, but there's a lot of things that Final Fantasy improved on over the first Dragon Quest. I think the first Final Fantasy is a better game than the first Dragon Quest. It's just a more user-friendly game. I like having a party of characters, and I think the story might be a little bit better. There really isn't too much that separates these games. It's just more of like a personal preference over the way you want to play a video game. Final Fantasy is the more complete RPG between these two. If you're looking to quickly get into the genre, this one is a very easy game to start with, whereas Dragon Quest can be a little frustrating, especially for somebody coming back to these games after, an extended break. I mean, both games were released in like the late 80s, so yeah, they've got some archaic stuff in them that's just not done anymore. When I look at the graphics as a whole, I would say Final Fantasy is overall better, but I enjoy the graphics in Dragon Quest more than this game. Well, they are darker in Final Fantasy and they match the tone of the story. There's something that I just enjoy about Dragon Quest a little bit more than that. That's probably the best way to transition into which of these two games would I rather be playing. I would rather play Dragon Quest over Final Fantasy. I've only beaten Dragon Quest a few times, and it feels like a fresher experience for me than going back and playing Final Fantasy for I don't even know how many times. I've been playing it on and off since probably 1992 or 1993, and at this point I'm kind of burnt out on it, so playing Dragon Quest, a game that I've only beaten maybe 5 times, it just feels a bit more fun, and not necessarily challenging, but it feels like an experience that I enjoy more than going back and playing Final Fantasy for the 10,000th time. I feel like I could beat Final Fantasy on autopilot. It feels like I know where everything is, I know where everything is, and it just kind of feels a bit stale at this point. Both of these games are good RPGs. Well, both have problems and mechanics that have been greatly improved upon in the sequels. There's something fun about seeing both of them, and seeing where these two long-running series began and comparing it to where they are now. So yeah, I'd rather sit down and play through Dragon Quest again than have to pick up and play through Final Fantasy one more time. Anyway, let's go ahead and wrap this up. I think these are both great retro RPGs. Both games are excellent starting points for people looking to get into the genre. I think Final Fantasy does a better job of just giving new players a hand when they're starting out. Dragon Quest has a few things that I don't like in it. Having to open up a menu to do specific actions is very annoying for me at this point. I'm sure some people like that, but it just isn't fun for me. I also don't like having to, use a spell in order to light up a dungeon or having to carry around torches. That just doesn't really seem like something that is enjoyable to me. I know it's a reference back to what you had to do with tabletop RPGs, but for me, I don't really want that in a console RPG, so yeah, that's just something that I don't like. If I hadn't played Final Fantasy a few 100 or 1,000 times or whatever it is at this point, I probably would have enjoyed that one more and selected that one as the game that I would rather be playing, but it just kind of feels a little bit stale because of how many times I have played and beaten it. I think Final Fantasy is the better game, but I would rather play the first Dragon Quest. Anyway, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.